Hello, everyone. This interview was recorded on February 21st, 2020. Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Jeff Nickoloff. Based in Phoenix, Jeff is a software engineer and an author who has extensive experience building and writing about large-scale technology services. He's also the co-founder of Topple, a team-focused consulting, training, and mentorship company. You can follow him on Twitter at allingeek and check out his website at allingeek.com, and you can find Topple at gotopple.com. Along with co-author Stephen Kinsley, Jeff is the author of the Manning Publications book, Docker in Action, 2nd edition. In this best-selling book, you'll learn everything you need to know about creating, deploying, and managing Docker containers and techniques applicable all the way from smaller environments up to big, full-scale cloud deployments. In this interview, we're going to talk about Jeff's background and career, professional interests, and his book. So thank you, Jeff, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in computers and software.
Oh, sure. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon in the 90s. But we got our first computer. We were very lucky. We got our first computer from my father's work. It was a business machine. It was this old IBM Business Partner was the brand. It was some 286 or something like that. No hard drive, just dual big old floppy disks. And it was pretty magic very early. I like to talk about inspiration all the time. For me, like one of my favorite movies as a kid was Explorers, had River Phoenix in it. And computers were tangentially into it, but I was kind of always into science and geeky stuff like that, which was really awesome. But then in middle school, we got the Pentium 90 machine, right? The first big classic killer. And just kind of really, it was just this raw machine, right? It was just Windows 3.1 with kind of like whatever AST was the manufacturer had put on it, and whatever software was kind of available on the big table at Costco. But like, it was just so much mystery and kind of like, but I really didn't have a whole lot of mentorship. There weren't a whole lot of resources around, which was kind of weird considering I was in the Silicon Forest and all of that. But, I kind of like took inspiration where I could, got into like a whole bunch of other people like modding Doom 2. Would just go to like the bookstore. Back in the day, like the bookstore actually had a nice, a variety of books in the computer section. So it was kind of like cut my teeth that way. I think I bought like a Java Swing book randomly. Did a little bit of C++, a lot of like scripting, just a ton of scripting, and then got way into building HTML and CSS really, really early. Then was just hacking more in high school, did a self-directed study on C++, and then went to ASU, got into their CS program, and went through that whole thing. But I was always kind of like a tinker. Like had a really hard time like focusing on one subject and just like crushing it. Usually because like courses just always take so long. Schools that are on semesters are like 16 weeks long. And so like, it never moves fast enough to keep me interested. And so like I got a job in IT at ASU. That wasn't my first IT job, but it was probably my most significant, early employment. But it was really great because I got this crazy deep exposure to a wide range of technologies. And really for the first time, it was where I had like this group of young adults who were much more experienced, and they gave that mentorship. And so like with a little bit of that like positive example and a little bit of that like, well, have you tried XYZ? Even if I'd never heard of XYZ before, it was enough to get me like into it. And that's kind of like when I hit my really crazy growth spike when it came to my professional skill set.
I've got a question about that. So ASU is Arizona State University.
Yeah. Sorry.
You moved from Oregon to Arizona, and I gather you've stayed there ever since.
Yeah, pretty much.
And so you studied computer science, and the question I always like to ask people who studied computer science, who I interview on this podcast, is if you were starting out again now, would you do a formal university computer science degree?
Yes, I would absolutely. In fact, towards the end of my college education, I actually discovered how to study for the first time. And so there was a lot of like kicking myself in the butt. I was like, well, if I had studied this hard since middle school, things would have probably been very different. But yeah, no, I do. But it really depends on like what you want. For me, what I want is I'm just really into knowing as much as I can. Like for me, like employment is like compensation is second to learning when it comes to like where I get my fulfillment from. And so for me, yeah, like I don't think I would have ever been satisfied without it, but it certainly is not something you absolutely need these days. So.
And you worked for ASU, as you were just explaining, and then you moved on, and you ended up working for a company that many people are familiar with, called Amazon. And I wanted to ask you about that. What was that like? And
I love it.
What did you do for them?
I was a software engineer. I came in as their levels don't really translate. I came in as a software engineer. It was great because I was in Phoenix. They opened a little dev shop in Phoenix. I think I was the fifth person in the office. But for the first time, like I was saying, like at ASU, I got like this handful of people who were technically significantly more mature than I was, and it was enough to really like throw gas on the fire. But when I went to Amazon, the people that I was working with were like, they just raised the bar for me in so many different ways. And it was really like the first 6 months of working there was like getting another 4-year degree worth of learning. It was just kind of crazy. So I just ate it up. I loved it.
It's really interesting. You mentioned on your website, allingeek.com, that you live the leadership principles at Amazon. And I'd heard about them before, and I checked them out. And I think most people are sort of skeptical of corporate speak, and these are our 5 points and stuff. But with the exception of leaders are often right, or leaders are right a lot. Personally, I when I read them, I was like, and I'd heard about them before, but like they're extremely reasonable. And you get an impression of one of the reasons it's such a successful company at doing what it does.
Well, I think that really for me the secret of Amazon is that they're probably the best managed company in the world, and so it's like the corporate speak is kind of one thing that's really easy to pick at. Like you see a document like this for a lot of companies, and you're just like, sure, sounds great, right? But in Amazon, like that document is your review criteria. This is, are you doing your job? Like, are you being an Amazonian? Are you like, should I be promoted? I don't know. Like, are you a leader? Like, what's the scope, the scope and impact of your leadership? And that's, they do a really, really good a really good job at Amazon, more so than any company I've worked with or really kind of like taken a look at in the past, of aligning everybody's interests very carefully. As an engineer, your interests are aligned with your customer's interests. As a manager, your interests are aligned with your engineer's interests, are aligned with your customer's interests, all the way down, all the way up through management. And that manifests in a lot of ways, some of which are very positive and some of which are particularly uncomfortable for people who are not used to feeling customer pain directly. So like, everybody's on call. I mean, your director is on call for the software that you write. And so if the software you write is of poor quality and it's creating poor customer experiences, then you're going to feel that pain. And unfortunately, at Amazon scale, if there's a little bit of customer pain for each individual customer, you're experiencing that times a million. And so it really, anyway, so they put these systems in place, and they really do seem to use that as kind of like their North Star, and they manage to them, and I think it works pretty well.
And do you have a fair amount of autonomy or sort of empowerment compared to other companies? Because one of their statements on these leadership principles is ownership, and it says leaders are owners. And I think, from a kind of old-timey perspective, you might read that and go, oh, shit, that means I'm, shit flows downhill, right? But actually, I, of course, read that to mean, like, you've got authority.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for every org, right? Like, everybody's experience there is different. They're a major employer. So, like, this is all anecdotal. But in my experience and from what I've seen, like, especially, like, they actually flow, ownership helps things actually flow up rather than down. It isn't about, like, you could say that if there was like something that's flowing down, deal with it. They had, I don't know if it's still on the website, but they had a leadership principle that was disagree and commit, where you're empowered to disagree, but ultimately, like, you're willing to commit to the group consensus direction. With regard to autonomy, autonomy is a really, really difficult or really interesting thing to talk about. And I think it really does come down to the team that you find yourself on or the org that you're in. A lot of times you give them very specific missions. But one thing that they do probably better at Amazon than any other place on the planet is they're really, really skilled at leveraging, like, group critical thought. So everybody really does, like, if you have insight into a problem and potential solutions, you're not only welcome to share it, you're compelled to share it, because at the end of the day, everyone involved is as culpable for the success or failure for that project as anybody else on the team. And so, there isn't I never really experienced any degree of because I said so type stuff. In fact, they have a really strong culture of, constructive feedback and, like, genuine constructive feedback. You don't get any benefit out of tearing anybody around you down or sabotaging their work, because at the end of the day, your interests are pretty well aligned with the interests of the people around you.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting. I've not myself worked for one of these giant companies, but people often, I think, we talk about tech and the tech sector, and people think of Amazon as a tech company, or they think of Tesla, for example, or SpaceX as tech companies. And it's often lost in the discourse is the fact that, the leadership from people like Bezos and Musk, and not to lionize anybody, but what they and their organizations have managed to do is innovate on the way people work together. And that's one of the reasons they're so successful. And, for example, a great example that I like is Tesla managed to build a big power station in Australia.
That was really cool.
Yeah, in like 3 months. And it's like, yes, a lot of technology went into that, but the system in place to get that initiated and completed with all and like just the regulation side alone, what the way everything has to be in alignment, the way there has to be no bullshit, or at least as little bullshit as possible. As you say, because I said so, or don't tell your boss they're wrong. Right. Stuff you can't get things done at that scale and that efficiently if there's human bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, really, you're hitting kind of on the thing that I've been focusing on for like the last year, which is really like the thing that they do is they have leveraged scalable communication. Better than, well, not better than everybody. There's actually quite a few companies that are doing it very well. But there's just not a lot of butts in seats mentality. There isn't a whole lot of we have to face-to-face talk about everything. If you have to have conversations about everything that you do, and the only way that you communicate is via conversation, or they're like short form writing, it's going to be miserable. Like, you'll never scale. You'll never be able to do anything repeatedly. All that communication is incredibly low fidelity. And you end up, 6 months, you'll go 6-month periods, and like half your team will be building one thing and the other half will be building something totally different. And then sales will be selling something that was completely not what you were doing. And marketing won't have been able to actually like message what's going on because, well, they're out of the loop. Like and those are the kinds of delays that end up really hurting most projects. The biggest difference I see between like the pardon the characterization, but like the lumbering enterprise, right? Like the slow moving, low self-confidence enterprises out there is almost purely in their communication mechanisms. They've got the people, like that's not a problem. It's really comes down to how do you communicate and do so in confidence and do so in a way that you can leverage that group critical thinking.
Yeah, I've got a few questions to ask you about that
Sure.
a little bit later, and so thank you for sort of foreshadowing.
Sure.
But before we do that, so you were at Amazon, you really enjoyed it, you learned a lot there, and then you decided to leave. Why was that?
Well, like 2013 was like this little miniature tech renaissance of the decade. Pretty much everything that happened in this decade happened in 2013 from a technology perspective. It was really an incredible year between like Oculus Rift happening. Oculus Rift was happening. This incredible 3D experiences was happening at the same time. We were seeing this boom of 3D printers. It was happening at the same time we saw this drone and autonomous drone technology. It was happening at the same time we saw Linux and Linux containers, and that kind of like turned into orchestration and microservices was kind of like booming. I could go on and on and on. Like pretty much everything interesting that happened really was seeded in that year and probably a little bit in 2012. And I'm sitting at Amazon, right? And I'm working in an incredibly fast-paced environment where we're talking about like problems at an incredible scale. And that was all great. But at the same time, like I'm looking at this really like whirlpool of crazy bleeding edge innovation that's happening. Like Hacker News was really exciting that year. And so I kind of got in my spare time, got to touch and get a little bit of experience with some of that stuff, especially around Docker. Like that for me was this really interesting project because, I could go home and in my free time, in under a couple minutes, download and install this project that it helped me do something that we were doing at Amazon. It was actually a little bit easier than working with packaging at Amazon, and it was free. Whereas Amazon's funding an entire team to build and maintain and develop those tools internally. And for the first time, like I was able to stick together like 3 or 4 technologies at home that allowed me to iterate and to build and iterate really, really rapidly. And that was really exciting. And so I just kind of like got way into it, and started doing a little bit of public speaking about it, talked around the office about it, did some like public talks about Docker. I don't think I'd started blogging about it yet at that point. And then in 2014, acquisitions editor at Manning called me up and just said he wanted to talk about Docker because I had been one of the handful of people that had come up when searching around for people who know anything about it. And, we had probably a good hour and a half long conversation. He asked me if I want to write a book, and I said yes. And then ended up, my plan was just to do it in spare time. I did the whole external work authorization request that they were having people do at the time. I was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it right. I don't want to be sneaky or anything like that because it's going to be a major work and my name's going to be out there and you're going to be able to buy it on Amazon. So went through the proper channels and they're like, oh, like the whole conversation got really muddy. My entire line of management were incredibly supportive about it. But it's a huge company, as you know. And so ultimately they were like, well, we're not really sure. Can you show us and then Amazon lawyers started talking. And like, for me personally, when lawyers start talking, they're like probably some of the best paid lawyers in the world. Like, I'm just going to go, I'm cool. So at that point, I had been there quite a while. I had felt like that I had learned not everything that I could, but at the very least on that team, in that space, in that like that set of technical challenges and in management, I had validated a lot and I had learned quite a bit. And so it's kind of like a natural time to make a move anyway. So I just said, well, I got an opportunity to do something that is fairly rare. So I'm just going to go do it. And so I bailed. And it was great.
Yeah. And it must have been really exciting to have that challenge of adventure being on your own.
Yeah, I think, people in tech, especially software engineers, are so fortunate these days. Like, really, a lot of my friends are kind of like, whoa, what are you going to do for money and all this kind of stuff? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm coming from one of the most well-known companies in the world with one of the most desirable and highly paid skill sets around. Like, I could just like walk into the street and hold my hand up for 5 minutes and say, I'm looking for a job, and have one by the next week. Like, this is not a high risk activity. There's no specific bravery here, right? Like, it's a very safe thing. And so, like, it was exciting and it was interesting, and it was great to kind of like hold myself to a little bit of, this high bar for self-motivation and discipline. But at the end of the day, that was kind of straightforward.
My next question is a bit of a digression, but was that when you started working in coffee shops?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes. Well, I had kind of like off and on the weekends and whatnot. I'd go out and hang out and do that whole thing. But, like one of the first things I did was, even like the month prior, I just bought a brand new MacBook. Love that machine. I'm talking to you on it right now. And just hit the coffee shop. I was like, look, I really don't need much. I'm a low overhead kind of guy. That's why I studied CS instead of an electrical degree. I'm not into the high capital type stuff. So I figure if I can get a chair, a cup of coffee, and a laptop together, I'm good.
I asked the question because, as I'm sure you guessed, because you have a great post on Medium, which I'll link to, of course, in the transcription of this episode about coffee shops. It's lengthy and very, very good. You are an expert on coffee shop, and so I wanted to ask you a couple of questions because a lot of Lean Pub authors and a lot of our listeners are software engineers, and a lot of them are quite independently minded. A lot of them actually worked for big companies and became consultants. And writing a book is an important thing to do if you want to be a consultant often.
Yep.
And so I wanted to ask the expert a couple of questions. So what's the most important thing? What's the first thing you look for in a coffee shop?
It kind of depends on what I'm looking for. Or, it kind of depends on like what I'm going there for. If I'm going because I desperately have to get some work done, all I really need is, a clean place to sit. I will buy something even if I know that the beverages aren't going to be that good, because like that's just part of this arrangement. I'm not paying for a $700 a month co-working space. I'm in a coffee shop, so I'm going to go there. I'm going to buy it. If I don't suspect that the coffee is very good, I'll get an iced tea, because iced tea is always great. I think I don't even need it to be particularly quiet. That's not really that big of a deal. It is a little bit of a turnoff if there's like a ton of kids running around and like bumping into stuff, or if it's particularly chaotic. But the white noise for me actually helps me focus. Besides, I've usually got huge headphones on, and it's not that big of a deal. If I'm going there for coffee, there's one telltale that I think is almost 100% for us, which is, if they sell more than one size of cappuccino, the espresso is probably not very good.
And why is that?
Pouring an espresso shot is easy to mess up. Like, it's actually a small miracle when people can get it right consistently. And so if they have like a very big menu, it's almost 100% of the time they're going to have multiple sizes of cappuccino. If it's right, like, and so if they have a very big menu, the chances that they're constantly pouring espresso shots is very low, right? Or that if they have like 40 different flavored drinks, people don't care what the espresso tastes like, right? Because it's going to get covered up with sugar. Like a cappuccino is espresso and a very specific amount of milk. And so like there's really nothing in that to kind of get in the way. But if you're looking for a really good third wave coffee shop, you can usually tell just by walking in and looking at the menu. If they've got more than one size cappuccino, then you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed. You should get like a mocha or something like that.
Yeah, I found that's a really great explanation. That hits with something. I've got a friend who's a bit of a sushi snob, or he would say selective probably or something like that.
Sure.
But the big menu is immediately a way of setting your expectations, and that's one thing I really liked about your post is like, it doesn't mean you now are in a negative relationship with this place. It's just like now you do your triage and now you understand the place you're in and you adjust what your expectations and your behavior.
Right. It's 100% about leveling your expectations. Like if I go in and I look around and I see a drink that's big, frothy foam, I know, okay, this is a French style coffee place, right? And they'll have the giant mugs and they'll be cozy and it'll be all sorts of like lovely and pseudo romantic. And so I'm not going to go in there and be like, I'm really in the mood for like a sharp third wave espresso shot. Like this, you're just never going to get it. It's going to be black. It's just going to be, it's not going to be right. And so, like I'm not going to go in and then be all upset, right? Like I'm going to go in and go, oh, okay, well, like I'm going to get a mocha or I'm going to get a big floofy thing and kind of like know what that's about. But it's a really interesting little microcosm because it really is like managing expectations is really what companies are all about, right? Like brand is established through consistency. When you're going to a universe of little coffee shops that are all different owners, all different brands, you don't expect a whole lot of consistency. If you're ordering the same thing, there's a temptation to do so. But I think that's pretty worn down. If I go to the same coffee shop, time after time after time, and it's variable, the quality there, I'm not going to go to that coffee shop for very much longer, right? Because I don't know what I'm buying before I give you money. I'm certainly not going to tip before I get my coffee, right? Which is another crazy kind of like pattern. Not that you should like tip people, but like, it feels like weird doing that when I have no idea what I'm even buying.
It's really interesting. You mentioned third wave. I'll ask you what that means in the coffee shop dimension in just a moment. But there's actually quite a funny coincidence here. Just a couple of interviews ago, I interviewed someone named Alex Hillman, who was involved in sort of first wave co-working. And he told me the origin story of first wave co-working, which was basically there were a bunch of people in San Francisco in the mid 2000s who loved to work in a coffee shop. And they'd show up en masse because they'd coordinate. And then it was like people didn't really understand what was going on. It's like all of a sudden a bunch of people showed up with laptops. They'd all be quietly sitting at different tables, and then they'd all laugh at the same time because they were all in the same like chat room. So like it was just sort of surreal. And then one day, and then maybe they didn't have their tipping etiquette down. Maybe people just didn't maybe they didn't drink as much coffee as they should have, so they'd get one cup and sit there for 8 hours or something like that.
Right,
and one day they all showed up, and the coffee shop manager had blocked all of the power outlets. And it was very like they knew like that is directed at us, and that is a way of telling us to not come here anymore. And some of them were opening up an office for a startup anyway, and they said, well, why don't we just get a bigger space than we were going to do otherwise, and now we'll have people come here. So there's an interesting connection. Anyway, but that was first wave. Then there was second wave, which was basically WeWork and the sort of commercialization of it. And then there's third wave, which is like sort of learning the lessons. Is third wave coffee shop, is that sort of similar along the trajectory like that?
Yes. I mean, like as soon as you say what something like that is, you're just going to get shredded by a whole bunch of pedantic definitions and a whole bunch mired in argument. I mean, I would just go out to say it's kind of like it's really like a return to like it's part of the food movement, right? So it's about like finding really good beans and like very purposeful roasting, and making like very purposeful coffee. I wouldn't say it's one kind or another, but it's like there's a lot of intent put into it. And so that's where you'll see people say, no, a cappuccino is this many ounces. Right? If you want something bigger than that, you want a latte. If you want something smaller than that, maybe you want a cortado, or maybe you want a macchiato, or like you get into these things. But it's kind of, I wouldn't say that like Starbucks that it's a reaction to a Starbucks coffee. But like the transitions from a Starbucks lifestyle into a third wave, like having appreciation for third wave coffee, is actually a pretty easy transition because it's very Italian tradition. You're not going to find a lot of French style. It's tight microphones when they're appropriate. It's really, really good espresso. It's espresso that you actually enjoy just drinking as espresso instead of it being some kind of like very black, abrasive experience. Unless that's specifically what you're going for. But like, you're not going to walk into, a very French style, more of like a hangout place that happens to serve coffee and, be able to talk to the barista about their single origin natural process beans. Like, that's just not going to happen. And that's fine. It's not for everybody. Not everybody has to get into it. I like it kind of accidentally. So, the more you learn about something, the more you begin to appreciate it, and then the more, you develop a taste for it.
Yeah, just to give people a sense of the level of detail that you can go into for appreciation of coffee shops, you talk about in your post about the importance of flat surfaces in bathrooms, so you can rest your laptop there. And when I was reading it, I was laughing out loud because I was reminded of how often nightclubs deliberately don't have flat surfaces because they don't want people doing cocaine in there.
Right.
But
no,
yeah,
in a coffee shop they sell the cocaine in the front. Right? Like
yeah, that's right. But that really resonated with me because in a former life I was an academic or in academia generally, and one of the things that I found really frustrating about working in libraries was what to do with my laptop when I had to go to the bathroom. And of course coffee shops have the same. I mean, I guess in libraries it's probably orders of magnitude safer generally to leave your laptop if you at a desk or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, you really have to make a judgment call. Every shop is different, right? If you're sitting there and there's 30 people that you see there every single day and it's otherwise a fairly low churn, then, but at the end of the day, like if you're working on something that's highly valuable on a machine that's highly valuable, then you should treat it with that appropriate level of respect. If you're working on your 5-year-old $2,000 machine at the time and all of your work is backed up and it's, properly encrypted at rest, so the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to lose a laptop, then forget about it. Just, flap it around, take as much risk as you're willing to allow or that you can tolerate.
Yeah, thanks for talking about that. I was really looking forward to.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. That was a really fun article to write, and boiled from a lot of opinion that had been formed over the last half decade.
Well, and it's also I think really important to think deeply about how the way we work and the way our spaces are designed affects the way we can work, and that's particularly true if you're independent. If you're independent, you can choose where to work, and you can probably make more choices about what your working space is like and what your working life is like.
You can certainly make a lot of poor choices. It's a lot easier to make poor choices, right? If you're going to even like it doesn't take much to inspire discipline. Like if you're getting up and going to the office at roughly the same time every day, you've already got that fundamental cadence built in. One of the first things that I see people struggle with is failing to maintain even something that looks like a rough, regular schedule, right? Like sometimes, like people who, and this is, again, not universal, but I see a lot of people like, man, I'm having a hard time getting started. And I'm like, well, and I come to find out, like they were working 4 hours in the middle of the night the other day, and then like 2 days later they're trying to work for 6 hours during the day in these large blocks, and they're not stretching or they're not doing basic self-care stuff. I'm like, Well, like why? You just have to like walk them through it with questions, right? Like let's see if we can solve the problem. But yeah, it's good to have the control, but it's not necessarily for everybody yet. So I think we've got a little ways to go.
And so, getting back to your career and to working independently, so you wrote your book, the first version of Docker in Action, and then you started a consultancy, I gather.
I did. I needed to make some money. The book took a little bit longer than I anticipated it taking, for a myriad of reasons. We would kind of like had these chunks of like high productivity with some travel interspersed in there, or long periods of editing that really weren't planned. And so it just took longer than we wanted it to. But 6 months in was basically like, I need to do something to start earning some money. Don't really want to get a full-time job yet, so let's see what's out there. And it was particularly fortuitous time for this whole thing because, I was very, very early. I'm an OG Docker captain, as they used to call it. But I was creating all sorts of content. I was doing a lot of blogging, still doing a lot of public speaking, and of course, writing the book, doing a lot of stuff to promote the book, running a meetup for Docker, or about Docker, not for Docker, and doing a lot of travel, and just kind of generally spreading the word. And so starting the consultancy, it was kind of hard, honestly. I met a couple people, through public speaking. It was usually like through the meetup or public speaking or things like that, where I would kind of meet a person and just kind of push it a little bit more. And it turns out I was talking to a decision maker who actually needed help or something like that. And so, that was okay. What I found, interestingly enough, maybe this is interesting. It was interesting to me, that 95% of the time they found me because of Docker, but almost never did they actually need help with Docker. Like they would say, oh yeah, we need this containers thing. But then they were just never ready for it. So it turned into a lot of, application design consulting. It turned into a lot of general automation and DevOps consulting. There was quite often we would end up talking about disposable infrastructure or like getting to the cloud or cloud management practices. This kind of like broad range of stuff that, of course, I had a lot of opinion about and had a lot of experience with, and all that stuff is so tightly coupled anyway. But yeah, so it was a good conversation starter, I would say.
And you mentioned communication earlier. And so you consulted for a few years, your book came out, and then you started Topple.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the company and its mission.
So we started Topple initially. It's a different entity, but really what we were coming around to was that the consulting that we were doing, it was not particularly fulfilling, if I can be totally blunt. The problems that our clients had were almost never technical. Certainly there were technical issues that we helped them work through and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, when our clients would fail or when they would encounter major setbacks, it was never because of technology. It was almost exclusively because of the communication patterns or their lack thereof. And so we were kind of like we took like a good 6 months to kind of really roll around like what's going on. Like, okay, we want to do something else. We don't want to necessarily chase the consulting anymore. So what do we want to do? We rolled around a couple of big ideas in open source or other things in the DevOps and infrastructure space, projects that we could kick off and really launch. But ultimately, like that whole industry by then had kind of, in my opinion, really eaten itself. There was so much consolidation and there was almost no innovation, with the exception of maybe two companies. Like it was all business model tweaking, and we had fallen into a very deep sales cycle. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It was just, but we're really trying to convert a lot of these adopters at the time. And so that was not a good place to be, to good kind of company to start. And so we kind of circle back around to this communication thing. And based on my time at Amazon, I said, I think I've got an idea. And so we started Topple really as this kind of second vessel, and to try to figure out what the business around communication looked like. Would it be training? Would it be consulting again? Would it be product? And really by the beginning of 2018, we saw a path forward for product. And it was really, so we kind of said like, okay, Amazon doesn't have these problems. So why doesn't Amazon have these problems? Or at least nowhere near to the degree everybody else does. And it really came back around to long form writing. If there is something that they need to communicate, they do it using long form writing. And it's very opinion. You don't just say long form writing. They wouldn't say that. They'd talk about their one pagers or their 6 pagers or Jeff Bezos's memos to shareholders. And it really comes down to memos. Long form writing to me is something that has a single document that has enough content that allows the reader to think critically about that content, right? And it doesn't have to be long. You can have long form writing that's a page if you can think critically about that subject matter in that page. And so this is something that they do for everything. There's a whole lot of other opinions, not just about the writing, but also in how they consume that content. And so what we did was we ended up writing some docs. We wrote a couple 6-page documents that says this is how to write to communicate at work. This is how to read to communicate at work, and this is how to manage using long form writing as your medium. And it's really that I believe that helps them scale, because they're able to communicate en masse with high fidelity and asynchronously, which is really remarkable. When I see the things that slow people down, or like at other large companies, it's when they communicate using PowerPoint slides, they don't actually say anything. It's basically a cave painting, right? It's incredibly low fidelity, raw construct, and they get a little bit from the orator, but ultimately the author, the presenter, is really hoping that the people consuming this content share enough background context that they can actually understand what's even going on. And the dirty little secret is that the audience talks so infrequently that the percentage of time where they actually have any idea what's going on is very, very, very low. And so it's almost a completely useless medium. I say like presentations are for sales. And I don't mean that in a bad way either, right? Because the purchase, like the way people make purchasing decisions, is very well studied, and it has absolutely nothing to do with evaluating things on merit. It's all about emotional appeal. And if I can think of one thing that you should not do internally for a company, it's make decisions based on the emotional appeal of a given solution.
This is a really interesting topic. It's very sort of deep and kind of like the nature of what it means to manage a successful company in an age when every company is a software company. And it's come up a few times on this podcast before. One observation I like to make, and it might be me who came up with it, or a colleague of mine I worked with a few years ago when we were working on a collaboration software product. But one of the reasons that it took so long for the personal computer to be adopted into businesses, into companies, was that typing was seen as an underling's activity, and it was gendered, right? So typing was women's work. And to this day, and I'm going to just go ahead and with the full-on stereotype and generalization here, an East Coast executive is someone who never touches a keyboard. And that's one of the reasons that BlackBerries took off so well, and one of the reasons that tablets and mobile phones became so popular. But an executive is sort of conceived of as and I'm going to gender it because it's gendered, as a man of action who's playing golf and getting on an airplane and having dinner and having a big time meeting and then
Right.
banging the table and making decisions. But the idea that sitting down and thinking about something at length and then writing about it and at length, as you point out, I think very well, doesn't necessarily mean a long document, right? What was the
Right.
Mark Twain joke? I'm sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one.
Right.
And this idea that if you're managing complex technology, which is what all companies have to do if they're going to succeed nowadays, the way you communicating intelligently and, as you say, asynchronously, which is a way of saying through documents, unless you can master that, you're not going to be. And the sort of like the paradox, I think, in a lot of people's thinking is, if you want to get that power station built in 3 months, you need to have a really robust.
They make micro optimizations for things that are fast, and in doing so, they sacrifice fidelity, and they lean on. Really what it comes down to is they think, oh, this has to be fast. I just want to get it out. You get all these minimization statements about communication. Can't I just send it via chat? Can't we just have a quick conversation, right? And it's incredibly harmful. Like you talked about the East Coast executives, but I actually think that we're facing this really interesting challenge. Because even you called out like tech and software, and like this is not different. This is we're actually in this really weird age where communication over distance and at scale has become so cheap that it's useless. It's completely and utterly useless. Internet comments, the value of any given tweet. You just like the Slack conversations are absolute garbage. Nothing like you can have the greatest conversation in the world, and like 70% of that conversation took place in your head. It never even got out of your mouth. Right. And there's no way to actually analyze like complex ideas or actually have thick, rich discourse, because we're always chasing the bleeding edge of the conversation. If it follows more, if some point follows more than like 2 sentences back, it's gone. Right. You'll never get back to it. It's incredibly linear. And so we're like very much like these slaves to this short form addiction. And it has really killed everybody. And I would say people in software are probably the worst of them all, because we're born of the internet today. Right. But, look at if you look back to a time when communication was not so cheap, it was all long form and it was done really well. George Washington is one of my favorite examples. This is a man who managed exclusively through documents. He would ask his generals each to draw up proposals, and they would write it in a letter. They'd send it to him, and he'd sit down and he'd read them both. He would think critically about the subject matter, and he'd render a decision, or he'd ask for additional information. Like this is the way that you work, that you manage at scale, right? And we've had the gift of writing since forever ago, and it was born out of the necessity to be accurate. I've got this really great post that I've used in some of my trainings. It's like the communication maturity timeline, and it's like one of the first records we have, like the line between prehistory and history, comes back around to people who had flocks of sheep. And before they would send their sheep out with the shepherd, they would want a record of how many sheep they gave to the shepherd to, roam the fields and graze. Because when they came back, if they didn't have the same number of sheep, they wanted to have something to point to, right? And so the first thing they did was it was really interesting. They had these like beads that they would press into clay, and they'd say, "This is how many we had," and they'd kind of like both agree to it, and then they'd count them up and do that whole thing. So it's like, if you want to be accurate about something, you want to be able to communicate with other people or even yourself across time, you have to write it down, and you have to write it down with high fidelity. I can't just blurt out 3 random words at someone and expect them to have 5 pages worth of material. And it really, yeah.
It's really interesting how fundamental this kind of thing is. I interviewed someone on this podcast a while ago named Ian Mile, who eventually became chief software architect for a giant multinational investment bank. And I hope I'm getting it right that it was him. But he had at one point earlier in his career been working for a gambling site. And there's millions and millions of dollars at stake every second. You have to get everything right. You have to be up all the time because there's a game on, right, that people are betting on, real time. And I think he at one point convinced his boss or colleague, I'm going to take a few months just to write documentation. And, that was sort of his ticket to a rocket ship career, right? Was really understanding everything, but taking this gamble, that I'm not going to be writing code or anything like that. I'm just going to be understanding everything and writing it down well, so that if something goes wrong, somebody not only has a place to go, but I have to structure it in such a way that they know where to go.
Right.
And it's that structure that's so important as well. So it's not just having the documents. There needs to be a structure to it, and there needs to be an understanding of how that structure works.
Yeah, and especially in software, I think it's really important to realize that we have this tendency to say documents to mean documentation. And there's certainly that is a real use for long form writing, and it's incredibly important, especially in operational scenarios, or basically if you want to do anything with a high degree of consistency, it has to be documented. You can't just sit down at an espresso machine and be like, I'm going to make espresso and just kind of figure it out on the fly and then figure it out every time. You say, no, what we're going to do is the water is going to be this temperature. There's going to be exactly this weight of espresso in this. I'm going to tamp it a very specific way. And when I make it, the machine is going to bring that water to a specific pressure for a certain amount of time. And it might back it off to a certain amount of pressure for a certain amount of time. And after a certain amount of time, it's over. Right. And when you can do that, when you can actually say, this is our process, you can execute consistently. Or that's what documentation and modeling the systems are for. But what's really missing, what we're not doing, is using documents to communicate. Right? These don't necessarily even need to be these maintained machines over time. This is ephemeral. This is point in time. It looks like journaling, and this is a particularly bad word among modern forward-thinking companies. But it looks like writing reports, which felt like this really gross thing that was a fallout from high bureaucracy environments. But I think there was misattribution there. They weren't bad because you were writing something. Reports are bad if they're not used. If you're doing work that doesn't make any sense, if it really is the bureaucracy that's the problem, not that you're writing to communicate. And really, there's another big leap. When people are talking about it these days, they talk about writing culture a lot. The word becomes writing culture, or the catchphrase, and it's really, the writing has almost nothing to do with it, which is something that I discovered over the last year and a half. The word you need to be looking for, if you're going to make a change in your organization, the change that you need to make is you need to be able to expect to read the things that you need to know to do your job. And because if you need to read it, someone will write it. But if you don't know what you need to read, you'll never get what you need written. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It totally does.
So if I can say, hey, I'm thinking about, or we're reviewing our business strategy, we're considering getting into the open source infrastructure software market. I need to know, what's the total market opportunity? What are some of the things? What are some of the pillars that our would-be competitors are marketing to? What are the values that they're trying to sell? Yada yada yada. What are the costs of their solutions? That kind of stuff. If I say I need to know these things, then a lot of people, maybe people don't even know things about those things, can actually answer those questions. You've scaled out the number of authors because you've been able to say, this is who I am, that I'm your audience. Because you've been able to say, I'm your audience. This is exactly what I need to know. This is when I need to know. This is why I need to know it. If you can answer these like 5 questions that we kind of like preach, then you can actually get the information you need quickly and way more effectively.
Speaking of knowing what to read, we've been talking for almost an hour now, and I think it might be time to move on to the subject of your book,
sure.
Docker in Action, and specifically the second edition. So without going sort of too deep into the weeds, I wanted to ask you if you could explain just, imagine you're talking to, and I'm sure actually this happens to you all the time, but if you're talking to someone who doesn't know how the computers go, what's Docker?
Oh, man. If I'm talking to somebody who doesn't know how the computers go, it's incredibly difficult to talk about. I would probably hit on, I don't know, man. Like, honestly, this is something that was specifically the question that held up chapter 1 for so long. Chapter 1 was a nightmare to write because there are so many ways to talk about the benefits of this technology that only someone who is experienced with software would really get. I could give that, and what everybody at the time, even now, was falling back on were like these metaphors. It's like a virtual machine, but it's not really. It's like an efficient virtual machine. But like all that messaging actually gave rise to an entire world of people with a fundamental misunderstanding who were technical of what the thing was. And it led to a whole universe of pedantic security arguments. And it did the whole thing a big, it was really rough. I think it had a lot of negative impact, that whole marketing challenge.
I want to, sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to say that's such a great answer on a number of levels. One of which is actually when I was reading the chapter, I was like, the first chapter of your book, I was like, that's an interesting way to open. You kind of open in medias res kind of thing. And I was like, I wonder what was behind that decision, because obviously it's a very carefully written book. And it was obviously there was a decision behind that, and I can see it. And another reason I like that answer so much is that oftentimes, like, and I'm sure someone listening who doesn't know how the computers go felt like I was being condescending when I put it that way, but
no.
And those the thing is, those explanations often when we're in contemporary, generally speaking, we have this common sense idea that anything can be, it's not explicit that we believe this in our minds, but that anything can be sort of more or less communicated pretty quickly. And that's just not to anybody, and that's just not true. And so often, because we have this non-explicit belief, where people are often immediately on the back foot if they can't understand something quickly.
Right.
And to say straight up, like, you just have to understand, in order to understand this concept, like what Docker is, you just have to, there's a lot of stuff you have to know first before we can talk about that. It's just, it's just a great answer. But I think if we approached many things in life that way, with that kind of understanding, a lot of us would be a lot less anxious and feel a lot less insulted. All the time.
It's hard. I mean, it's so hard, right? Because I was learning about writing a book as I was doing it. The conversations that I was having with my publisher and with the development editor, and the feedback were just like across the board about chapter 1. Everybody wanted to put the entire chapter into the first paragraph. Like, really, the first paragraph of the first chapter of the book was by far and away the hardest thing to write. Not because it was bad writing or because I was learning to write. I went through probably 1,000 completely viable first paragraphs. But the problem was that every person you bring it to and ask for feedback brings their own context. Right. And if they want to have all their questions answered in the first paragraph, no one will be happy. This is a please everyone type scenario. So for the executives, the CTOs out there or the analysts that just want to read the first chapter of a book, like, you know, if I really am writing a first chapter to talk to those individuals, then everyone else should just skip the first chapter, right? Or bring something into the front matter that says executive summary, an actual executive summary, something like that. But it was so frustrating. Everybody wanted something different from it. And no two metaphors worked for anybody. And so it was really super challenging. Like, that was absolute misery. But lessons learned, right? And the more I've learned about marketing and messaging and even sales, or, you know, since then, has been like completely eye-opening. I'm like, okay, well, this is what they were going for. I really kind of wish they would have just come out and said certain things much earlier, because it would have taught me, and I probably would have been able to come to what they were looking for much more quickly. So
yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. You know, a large part of our audience is authors or would-be authors, and hearing about how difficult these things can be sometimes, and the discussions that can happen around things, I think helps people feel a little bit less alone when they come to face them themselves. And so one of the interesting things about Docker, I think, is that in order to understand it, it's important to have an understanding of the history of computing. And this is probably, anyone who's interested in something could probably say the same thing about it. But so let's try and talk about it to someone who sort of knows enough has enough concepts to understand what it is. Is there? So, for example, sorry, just give a little bit of context. I know a little bit of programming and stuff like that, and I used to build financial models in my investment banking days and stuff like that, but I'm LeanPub's resident non-technical person.
Sure.
So let's put it this way. Let's say you're actually talking to me and you're trying to explain to me what Docker is. What would you...
If I'm talking to you and you have a little bit of programming experience, there's a term that almost all programmers become familiar with early in their career called dependency hell. Where you're trying to write something or you're trying to install something, and it depends on a whole world of different things. And when you try to install them, you find out, well, like, I need this version. I need it, like, if I've got, you know, my library A, and the software I'm trying to install needs version 2 of that, well, then, like, some other program that I also need to use explicitly requires version 1 of it. And so you have to figure out ways to carefully untangle this very difficult to discover web of dependencies when all of those projects are sitting next to each other, right? Because they're pulling from the same locations, which means you can't have two versions of the same thing in the same location. It just doesn't work. And so one of the biggest benefits that Docker provides is it allows software authors to package up their software and almost all of its dependencies into a single kind of like abstract blob, right? And as a consumer, you can install these packaged blobs of software, and they can all coexist, and they can all run at the same time. This was, for me, this was my eureka moment with Docker. I'll give you the brief story. So like 6 months prior to learning about Docker in May 2013, I was trying to I wanted to use a time series database for one of my personal projects, because, you know, Amazon had a few that were really, really good. I loved them. I became just absolutely enamored with doing that. So I was like, I'm going to do this at home. And I found what probably the most popular open source project at the time is called Graphite. And I went home, you know, one day after work, and I was like way into it. I'm like, I'm going to get this thing set up and installed, and I'm going to have a nice setup, and I'm going to be able to do my stuff. And I spent the next 8 hours going through probably 10 different installation guides, pouring through config files to find commented out comments saying like, oh, if you actually want to install this thing, do this thing, and then fighting with the dependency, the whole thing. And even at the end of 8 hours, I couldn't get it done. I was just like, look, this is garbage. I never want to touch this again. I'm over it. And then 6 months later, come around to Docker, and I'm like, all right, cool. Let's kick the tires on this. Didn't really understand what it was all about yet, but I knew that I could install software. And This was really early. They didn't have Docker Hub yet, but they had like some kind of index for pulling software. And I said, let's try this out. And sure enough, I found an image that had graphite in it. And, including the time it took for me to install Docker, I had the graphite up and running within 2.5 minutes. And I was just like, oh my God, like this absolutely changes everything, right? Because suddenly I didn't have to pour through all that wasted effort, right? They're letting the software author or the publisher package their software in a way that makes it consumable at scale. I no longer had to have an incredibly deep understanding of the software I want to consume in order to do so. And for me, that was like the real lights on moment. This was the value that it was contributing at scale. And there's a whole universe of other benefits associated with using containers, Docker or otherwise today. But I think that was probably the biggest and continues to be the biggest benefit of using that software.
Right. Thank you very much for that. That explains that got across to me some things that I hadn't quite internalized yet. But so, for example, I remember one time I was, working on, I was sort of managing some programmers developing an app, and this app was, on the App Store, and
Yep.
It was dependent on things external to itself.
Right.
And so it would sometimes break.
Yep.
And so the idea behind the Docker and containers or containerization had existed as a concept for a long time. Docker
Yep.
was one of the things that made it sort of usable, as it were, to just really shortcut the explanation. But what happens is, instead of having like this library that an app is dependent on being external to the app and changeable, right? So that then the way the app looks at it breaks.
Right.
You actually put an instance of that library into a little box, into a box with
Yep.
that app, and then that is all working on its own.
It had its own little copy of the whole world, right? It had everything it needed right there, and everywhere you go to pick up and drop this app, it carries it along with it. It doesn't have to worry. I mean, it still does have to worry about the way it interacts with the system on an app, and just or whether it's a browser or an app or Linux itself. There is a little bit there, but it dramatically reduced that surface.
And as I understand it as well, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but these containers are immutable. Is that correct? And so is that generally? Here's my cartoon. Here's my cartoon understanding of this. It used to be that you had your code out there somewhere running, mm-hmm. right? And if you wanted to change it, you would go into it and change part of it. And that's something that's mutable. And something that's immutable means, no, I'm not going to go into something that's out there and change it. I'm going to destroy it and replace it with something else.
Right. Yes. So no, yes and no.
Okay.
The intent is to be immutable. They do not have to be immutable. Docker and containers provide a lot of really interesting way to provide reuse in ways that promote not changing things. Because the hardest thing about making real immutable systems is the fact that everything is designed to be changed, right? This is like the root of modern computer architecture, and so people say immutable. What they really mean is disposable. Okay, I don't know who it was that wrote the book somewhere that proliferated the term immutable infrastructure or immutable computing. That it is absolutely the completely incorrect term. When people are talking about pets versus cattle or the getting rid of things when they're the old configuration, what they're really talking about is disposability. And they because containers are it's so easy to be consistent with creating them because it's formulaic, right? I mean, we have this higher level abstraction that literally does the exact same thing every single time given the exact same inputs. It way reduced the bar to installing things. It gave us a language for talking about running software and moving around software and running software that was a little bit more platform agnostic than it had been in the past. And that was really, really powerful. But yeah, so like this is a whole suite of tools, and really the whole ecosystem that grew around it. Whether we're talking about Terraform from HashiCorp or other, DevOps tool suites, like it was really about seeking the best practice of changing things as little as possible, right? Like instead just like disposing of a prior generation and being able to bring the system up in any state along its timeline, right? Like a rollback does not necessarily mean mutating something back in time. It means literally blowing away the new thing and creating new from previous versions of the input, right? And so it is a roll forward. I could geek out on that all day if you let me keep talking.
No, that's a great explanation. But yeah, just on the subject of change, so Docker itself has changed.
Yeah,
and you're writing a second edition of your book along with your co-author.
Yep. It's out.
It's complete.
Yes, it is. We finished it. I don't even remember.
Oh, sorry.
Late summer.
Sorry about that. I live so much in the world of in progress publishing.
No.
It completed, but yeah. So that's fantastic. And,
believe me, I can relate to that.
And what were some of the things that are new to the second edition of Docker in Action?
So the first edition was published kind of like on the precipice of what became known as orchestration and clustered platforms for running containerized software. And at the time that I published that book, Kubernetes was still very, very, very young and very volatile. Amazon had the Elastic Compute Service out, and that was the default way to run containers in the cloud. And Docker had, I think, for like the 6 months prior to writing the last chapter, had released something called Swarm, and which was just a very little, proof of concept grade cluster control suite. And so the last chapter of the book, I think I even prefaced it with like, hey, heads up, like, all of this material is volatile, right? Like we're at the beginning of something crazy and new, but if you want to touch it and get interested in what's going on, here's chapter, I think 13 or 12 or 13. And so between then and the time we published this book, like the whole world had shifted, and it became way like the whole, for whatever reason, it seems like that entire world became focused on high scale service software, because all of those companies ultimately were interested really in selling to enterprise. And all of those enterprises wanted to run service software, and they were all obsessed with high scale, whether or not they needed. And so that was really where it came back around to. And so we got a new version of Swarm matured into something that was actually baked into Docker. Kubernetes matured and had really taken off. We got some actual cloud specific tools and a whole bunch of stuff. But that was the biggest change. For the most part, the material in the first edition was held up really well. There was a few things that needed to be cleaned up, a few minor things that needed to be added, definitely some errata to take care of. But for the most part, it worked out really well. I think we only ended up rewriting one or two chapters that really they were just hard for people to read. And so we tried to clean up that material as best we can and maybe pivot on the way that we were explaining some of the concepts. And then the last third of the book, we just ripped out and replaced with something that was new. It was, chapter 11 is all about service software. We removed the chapter about running Docker registries and I think we added a chapter on actually publishing pipelines and integrating that stuff with your CI/CD. But we focused on Docker Swarm, partially because it was built in. Anybody that was using Docker has it. But also because it was a very, compared to Kubernetes, it's a very straightforward platform to understand. And besides, most of the concept, really, we're using Docker in Action to teach concepts, right? Because if you understand roughly what it's doing, you learn a lot about the system, plus you get to be much more productive in what you're doing. And so Docker Swarm is a completely appropriate tool suite for teaching those things, and it's running everywhere where Docker is anyway. So we didn't have to worry about any kind of crazy. We were very picky in our picking third-party dependencies. So I can't imagine having written a book about Kubernetes. I mean, every edition would be complete rewrite with the amount of change that's happened to that ecosystem. So very, very pleased with our decision not to include that.
Actually, on the subject of Kubernetes, is the fact that it changes so much a drawback in your opinion?
No. I have a really interesting relationship with Kubernetes in that I think fundamentally it's fine for what it is. I think from a software architecture perspective, they made some very interesting choices early on that were honestly really awesome, but it looks just like any other piece of service software when you actually look at it. But the problem that I have with Kubernetes isn't so much from a user's perspective. I think from a developer's perspective, it's fine. It might be a little bit verbose in places, but because it can do a lot, and I think that's really good. It's a very good general platform. From a systems operator perspective, I would never take that job in a million years. The number of failure modes, the number of ways that system can fail is really amazing. And it's just a lot of work. And not something that I think 90% of people, or 90% of people who could do it would actually want to. So yeah, it's fine. It does a good job. I have Kubernetes running locally, but only because Docker ships with it now. So
thanks very much. Thanks very much for sharing that opinion. Really appreciate that. Moving on just to the last part of the interview, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your experience as an author of books.
Sure.
And so you wrote your first book. I mean, you had a development editor and a team because you were working with Manning. But then for the second edition, you worked with a co-author. Mm-hmm. What was that? How did you guys manage that?
Well, it was interesting because we were coming from two very different levels of experience at that point. Stephen's a great author. He had never written a book before, right? And I had written a book and learned a lot about writing books in that time. And so the deal I cut was look, I don't really actually have time to do this. So why don't you champion the new content or most of the new content, and I'll work on cleanup stuff. I did write one or two new chapters. Or one replacement chapter, and then I rewrote, I think, 2 chapters. But and so it was a nice, clear delineation of who was responsible for what. But we bounced ideas off each other frequently. We had regular, conversations, and we handed each other iterations for feedback. And so, I read what he wrote and gave him feedback, and he read what I wrote and gave me feedback, just like we would working with a development editor or a copy editor. I worked really hard to try to manage his expectations better than mine were. I can be a bit of a perfectionist, and so there was a lot of parts of working with copy editors or working with technical editors that especially early when I was in my first edition, just really rubbed me the wrong way. I mean, I went into it with an open mind, but like chapter 1, where I'm getting, a very strongly opinionated and conflicting feedback from every person I'm getting about the first paragraph, right? At a certain point, I'm just going to go, okay, well, this is the paragraph. I'm not interested in your feedback anymore. But I had to learn that, right? Or I had to learn that that not all feedback you get from a technical editor is particularly useful, right? A lot of times they just kind of want to share in their experience, and they will give feedback that's like, this isn't the way we do it where I work. I'm like, well, I'm really not particularly interested in that. And so like, it's a big exercise in managing your own expectations for what kind of feedback you'll receive, and really a good exercise in learning how to ask for feedback and constrain the feedback. If you say, what do you think? Someone's going to say, I like it, which is just garbage feedback, right? Like I get nothing from that. But if I say, I need to understand, like, how many times did you have to reread these 3 paragraphs before you could understand the thing? Or maybe like ask them, like, what did you take away from this paragraph? Or can you explain something that happened in this section? And be specific. The other thing that I tried to manage his expectations around were kind of like the whole process overall, and what level of like what to expect during the copy editing, what to expect during typesetting, and all of that kind of stuff. So, and it was really fun. Like, I mean, he experienced a lot of the same frustrations that I did, even though he had forewarning. But it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. I think that's just an excellent story for people to hear, especially if you're going to be working with other people, and particularly if you're working with a publishing company and they're going to assign editors to you. How you interact with them is can be very challenging in a number of different ways.
Yeah, it was good to learn. I'm glad that I did it. I think it really kind of informed a lot about like the process of building and marketing a book. I'm pretty confident that I understand it well enough that I could assemble the team and establish the cadence and communication touch points in order to do it myself. Like, I could probably self-publish now and be very comfortable with it. I know a lot of copywriters, copy editors, and people in that space who I'm sure that I could pull in to, get feedback when I needed it. But I'm glad that we did it. So,
and there's a version of this question that I asked to LeanPub authors if I'm interviewing them for this podcast, which is, if there's one thing we could fix for you or one thing we could build for you, what would you ask us to do? And so with respect to the publishing process generally and your experience of it, if there was one thing that you could fix or one kind of, world peace button you could click.
I'm just like, if I find myself imagining the responses that you get, I think I never care about tooling. I think that's probably some nice low-hanging fruit for people to talk about. People might be like, oh, I wish we could wrote our book in Markdown and put it in GitHub or something like that. Or, I wish we were can't I just use Google Docs for everything? But like, there's so many opinions in that world on like what the right public, development tooling looks like, that I really don't care. Like, I'm pretty flexible in that regard. And so I think when we were doing it, they were just working on some of their more forward-leaning tech at Manning. But I mean, I wrote it in Word using their Word templates, and which were very rough. And I was working on Word in a Mac, so like half the things in the template weren't portable, and there was version conflicts, like everything Microsoft. And so it was just like all sorts of weird stuff. And rather than like investing in fixing it, because this is not something that I need to do at scale, I need to write one book. Can I just learn how to work these garbage templates or these buggy templates long enough to get through this book? And I did, and it was great. And, I didn't worry about solving the deeper problem or anything like that. So, I'm pretty tolerant of that. I think that there's one thing that I would fix or invest in. I don't know that it's a good idea. I just really like helping people understand and level their expectations for what they're doing, what to expect out of it, and really help them understand for themselves why they're doing it. I was doing it because I knew it was going to be hard, and it was a rare opportunity, and I knew that I would learn a lot, and I did all of those things. I would not have done it and I was pretty realistic about with myself about like what kind of like monetary compensation to expect. Or I was realistic with myself in like what I knew about publishing and writing a book beforehand, which was almost nothing. But I can imagine a lot of people maybe not going into it with the same kind of mental readiness. So onboarding experience, I think, is probably pretty good. If there's publishers out there who are having a hard time with authors not finishing their work, then that's probably your problem. Like they're probably in it for the wrong reasons, getting frustrated and bailing. So that'd be it.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. That's very insightful, I think. And it is something that anyone who, in any long-term project, but a book is a particular kind of long-term project, and really one ought to think hard about what one's in it for before getting going. And it's not just because you don't want to sort of like have a concept of wasting your time. It's just that like if you have an idea of what you're going in it for, when you encounter setbacks and stuff like that, you have a context to put them in. And that can be really helpful for getting to completion. Jeff, thank you very much for doing this interview and taking this time and for being willing to gamely cover so much ground. We talked about Amazon and coffee shops and things high and low. And thanks for your insights about writing and publishing as well. I really appreciated that.
No, thanks for having me. It was a joy. And let me know if you ever want to talk again.
Okay, thanks very much. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter Podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Lean Pub author, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.